Have you ever stood in a room so silent it devours your breath? At Black Hollow Plantation, a giant moved like a shadow, 7 feet tall, unmoving, unyielding. Masters trembled at his gaze, and whispers say that 9 men vanished beneath the weight of his wrath, without a single word spoken. Jacob was no ordinary man. Born on a small Carolina farm in 1823, he grew taller than any overseer could fathom, his arms long and coiled with muscle. As a child, he was quiet, watching the world from shadows, speaking only when necessary. The elders whispered he carried the weight of something ancient within him, a calm that concealed a storm. From the moment he arrived at Black Hollow Plantation, fear followed in his wake. The fields were vast, the cotton high, but the workers, especially those tasked with cruelty, kept their distance. Jacob moved with deliberate silence, his gaze unflinching. When a whip cracked across a man or woman, he would only watch, no word, no protest. Yet even the fiercest overseers felt their courage drain, as though his very presence pressed against their ribs. Stories began to circulate, tools broken inexplicably, fences toppled without wind, horses refusing to follow commands. Masters scoffed at superstition, calling him lazy or stubborn, yet unease grew. Night after night, the plantation rattled with sounds that no one could explain. Heavy footsteps, chains clanging, doors creaking when empty. Jacob's silence became his power. He spoke rarely, only to correct an injustice, and even then, his words were measured like thunder breaking in a distant sky. Plantation hands learned quickly, to fear Jacob was to survive. By the time he reached 21, whispers of his size, strength, and uncanny calm had reached surrounding counties. Men who tried to assert dominance found themselves injured, humiliated, or retreating in fear. No one could pin blame. No one could challenge the quiet storm in his chest. Minnie Hook. One night, 9 of the plantation's most ruthless overseers vanished. The campfires burned low, tools lay scattered, and all that remained was Jacob, standing at the edge of the fields, silent, watching. Jacob moved through the fields as though the earth itself bent around him. His footsteps were measured, deliberate, each one leaving a subtle depression in the soil that remained long after he passed. At 7 feet tall, he towered above everyone, his shoulders broad, hands capable of bending iron gates as if they were reeds. Yet he rarely spoke. When he did, his voice was low, resonant, and carried the weight of authority that needed no argument. From sunrise to sunset, Jacob labored like any other, planting, harvesting, and tending the rows of cotton with astonishing speed. Yet there was a rhythm to him that unsettled the other workers. Horses shifted uneasily as he passed. The wind seemed to change direction to avoid him. Birds took flight, startled by a shadow they could not identify. Masters and overseers soon learned the futility of confrontation. Every attempt to challenge him ended in humiliation or accident. Tools slipped from hands that tried to strike him. Planks broke under those who approached with ill intent. Even the smallest misstep seemed magnified in his presence. The plantation staff began to speak of Jacob as if he were both man and omen. Children avoided his path, not out of malice, but instinctual fear. The elderly servants whispered that his silence was not a choice, but a vow, a shield against a world that would not understand the power he carried. At night, Jacob's shadow stretched across the dormitories and barns, a looming presence that seemed to linger even after he left. He would sometimes walk the perimeter, inspecting fences, paths, and gates, and in those hours, no one dared utter a sound. The only noises came from the wind and the distant calls of nocturnal animals, as if the plantation itself respected his dominion. Even the masters began to note strange phenomena in his absence. Objects shifted, doors were found ajar, and animals behaved erratically. Some began to claim that the land obeyed Jacob as much as he obeyed it. He was a man of immense strength, yet it was the calm in his eyes, the quiet certainty of his movements, that made him truly formidable. By his 25th year, Jacob had become more legend than laborer, the giant who walked in silence, whose presence alone kept fear and order in balance. No one dared to test him, yet all watched, waiting for the first sign that his patience might end, for the first whisper that the silent giant would act. The overseers of Black Hollow had never known fear like this. They had commanded men and women with iron whips and sharp tongues, yet Jacob's silent presence rendered them powerless. Nights became the worst. Around the lanterns, they spoke in hushed tones, telling one another what could not be proved, that the giant moved like a shadow, appearing where he was least expected, a sentinel who watched every misstep. Rumors traveled quickly through the plantation. Tools left carelessly would vanish or break. Horses bolted when approached. Even the dogs, fierce and loyal, would back away from Jacob's path. Overseers swore they felt invisible hands pressing against their chests, slowing their pulse, tightening their breath. It was as if the very air conspired to protect him. At the quarters, the slaves spoke more openly, though only among themselves. Jacob was not merely a man of enormous strength. He was a symbol, a silent force that balanced cruelty with justice. Some whispered that he had learned the secret of the master's fears, and that he could end them without lifting a hand. Others said the land itself obeyed him, carrying him swiftly across fields, through forests, and over fences in a way that made pursuit impossible. The overseers attempted intimidation at first. They shouted at him, struck at him with whips, and tried to force obedience. But every attempt ended in humiliation. A plank snapped beneath a man's feet. A horse bolted mid-charge. A tool slipped from a calloused hand and struck only the wielder. Jacob said nothing. He moved as though time itself followed his command, and the overseers learned quickly that their authority carried no weight against him. In whispered meetings under the fading sun, they began to make calculations. Some swore that Jacob had the strength of 10 men. Others feared his silence, claiming it was deliberate, a warning in itself. Masters would check the perimeter, counting heads and ensuring locks were fastened. Yet by the time they returned to the main house, Jacob would already be at the opposite end of the plantation, surveying, waiting, unmoved. The tension reached a quiet crescendo. In the dead of night, some men reported hearing footsteps where no one walked. Shadows shifted, seeming to stretch toward the overseers, warning them of invisible presence. And one by one, the most ruthless, began to disappear, slipping from the world in ways no one could explain, leaving the remaining men to wonder if the silent giant had become more than human, a force the land itself could not contain. By dawn, the whispers were no longer secret. Everyone on Black Hollow knew Jacob's silence was not weakness, it was inevitability, and none could predict when it would strike next. By the spring of 1848, the plantation was a stage of unspoken terror. Masters who had once ruled with absolute authority now tiptoed across the fields, glancing over their shoulders, praying for invisibility. Jacob had become a presence that bent reality, silent, massive, and impossibly calm. The first disappearance occurred on a warm April evening. Overseer Hawthorne, known for his brutality, was found missing from his quarters. Windows were latched, doors locked, and the paths between the cabins undisturbed. The only sign of his absence was the overturned inkstand on his desk and the lingering smell of wet earth. The workers murmured among themselves that he had been taken by the land itself, or perhaps by the silent giant who watched every corner of Black Hollow. Then came more. Masters vanished in the fields, in the barns, even within the supposed safety of the main house. Sometimes a dog would bark, then go silent. Sometimes a tool would drop to the ground, inexplicably shattered. Nothing could explain the void left behind. No one saw Jacob move. No one heard his footsteps. Yet he was everywhere, the air around him charged with menace. The remaining overseers huddled together at night, speaking in murmurs, calculating which corner of the plantation might be safest. They checked locks, barred doors, even slept in the barns for hours at a time. But still, the next disappearance occurred. Panic spread like wildfire, reaching the town beyond the woods. Merchants, travelers, and neighboring planters whispered of a 7-foot shadow who moved without sound and brought justice in his wake. Jacob's silence became a weapon. A single glance, a shift of his massive shoulders, was enough to stop. even the fiercest man in his tracks. Masters began to dread even walking in the sunlight, knowing the giant could appear behind a fence, on a roof, or in the path of the mill pond without warning. The unseen threat was more effective than any whip, more terrifying than any threat of punishment. Some of the enslaved workers told one another that Jacob's strength was unmatched. Yes, but it was his patience that truly unnerved the masters. He did not act from passion or anger. He waited. He watched. He became inevitability made flesh, a silent reckoning that no man could outrun. By midsummer, the plantation had emptied of anyone willing to enforce cruelty. Only Jacob remained in full measure, walking the fields in measured silence, tending the crops and observing every corner. His shadow stretched across the land like a living thing, and the remaining men knew without question that he had become the guardian of the plantation and the arbiter of its terrible justice. Word of the silent giant spread quickly beyond the boundaries of Black Hollow. In nearby counties, planters and merchants whispered tales of a 7-foot man whose presence could unnerve the most seasoned overseer. No one dared to approach the plantation uninvited. Rumors claimed the soil itself trembled when he walked, and shadows lengthened unnaturally in his wake. Travelers spoke of Jacob with awe and unease. A neighboring farmer claimed he saw a massive figure crossing a field at dusk, walking with perfect balance on uneven ground, never touching the plants, yet leaving impressions in the earth as though the land had welcomed him. Merchants passing through the town reported overhearing conversations in darkened taverns. The giant was a man of silent vengeance, a force that could appear anywhere, anytime. Locals debated whether Jacob was human at all. Some said he was a spirit sent to punish cruelty. Others believed he had grown to this impossible size because the world had called him forth. Children whispered to each other in the shadows that Jacob watched, always watching, and even adults felt the chill of his gaze without seeing him. Masters from distant plantations began to alter their behavior. They refrained from cruelty, their tone moderated, their actions cautious. Overseers who had once demanded obedience now hesitated, glancing over shoulders, imagining the giant appearing silently behind them. Letters written from nearby counties cautioned friends to leave Black Hollow alone, to respect the power that slept quietly among the cotton rows. Even in the slave quarters, Jacob's reputation had taken on mythic proportions. He was no longer just a man, he was a living parable, a reminder that tyranny could not escape its consequences. Families told their children to obey and to watch their hearts, lest they tempt a power far beyond understanding. Despite the fear, Jacob remained consistent in his routine. He worked in the fields, repaired fences, tended livestock, and moved among the workers silently. There was no rage in his actions, only precision. His calm created unease as surely as fire spreads. The plantation became a stage of controlled tension, a place where every motion and every glance carried meaning. The surrounding counties felt the ripple of this terror. Traders refused passage along certain roads, preachers hesitated to cross into the plantation, and even the law seemed reluctant to intervene. Jacob had become a legend in his lifetime, a 7-foot sentinel, silent but omnipresent, whose mere existence enforced a balance that no man dared challenge. By the end of the year, Black Hollow had become isolated, feared, and almost sacred in its terror. It was no longer simply a plantation. It was a monument to the quiet, unstoppable power of the giant who refused to speak, but whose presence alone reshaped the land around him. Even those who labored under Jacob's watch began to feel unease. Though he never raised a hand in anger toward the enslaved, his size and stillness created a presence that was impossible to ignore. Shadows seemed to cling to him as he moved through the fields, stretching unnaturally, bending around corners, lingering long after he passed. Workers whispered about seeing him in places he should not have been. Crouched silently in the barn when they had left him in the fields, standing at the edge of a pond when they were certain he was mending fences. His movements were deliberate, but impossible to track, like a living shadow that flowed with the terrain. Some nights, those who dared leave the cabins reported faint sounds that carried through the still air. A heavy footstep across the field, a rustle in the trees, or the subtle pressure of air shifting as though he had passed just behind them. they learned quickly to remain calm, to speak softly, and to acknowledge his presence without provocation. Even in the labor, his watchfulness created discipline. Fields were neatly tended, fences repaired without oversight, and animals followed orders without conflict. The workers knew that their own safety, and even the fragile order of the plantation, rested on obeying the rhythm he set. Quiet, careful, unavoidable. Jacob's silence had become a language in itself. A glance could stop a quarrel before it began. A pause of his foot could redirect a worker to another task without a word. And when anyone crossed a boundary he had set, either intentionally or unknowingly, the land itself seemed to respond. Tools slipped, doors jammed, and animals reacted instinctively, almost as if he commanded not just the men, but the very air, earth, and sky. The elders among the enslaved began to speak of him in reverent tones, calling him the Watcher, the one who did not need to speak to ensure justice. Tales of his size and strength blended with legend, forming a narrative that grew in the dark corners of the quarters. Children were warned, obey, watch, and never tempt the silent giant. Yet even among the workers there was awe mingled with fear. Jacob's calm was unbroken, his routines flawless, and his presence immutable. He had become a force neither man nor master could fully comprehend, part shadow, part human, all inevitability. By the close of the season, the workers no longer questioned his authority. They moved as he moved, spoke when he allowed, and worked as though every step and every glance might be seen, judged, and silently recorded. Black Hollow had become a world defined not by the cruelty of masters, but by the quiet, absolute power of the 7-foot sentinel. The story of the 9 overseers who disappeared spread like wildfire through the South. Their names, Hawthorne, Pickens, Carter, Bellamy, and others, were whispered in reverence and fear. No one knew exactly how they vanished, only that after their absences, the plantation felt different, heavier, as if the very air remembered what had occurred. The first to disappear, Hawthorne, was notorious for cruelty. He had demanded obedience from all, striking without warning, punishing without reason. Yet one evening, he failed to return from inspecting the cotton rows. His quarters remained untouched, meals left on the table, candle wax still warm, but he was gone. Attempts to locate him ended in silence. No tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing. Soon, others followed. Carter vanished in the barn, leaving only a broken pitchfork and a puddle of water reflecting the moonlight. Pickens disappeared in the stables, Bellamy while inspecting fences. The story spread faster than the truth. Some claimed they had been struck by Jacob himself. Others insisted the land had taken them, delivering justice through its silent champion. The enslaved workers, who witnessed Jacob's strength firsthand, whispered a different theory, that he had become more than human, a vessel for vengeance that required no word, no movement beyond what was necessary. To them, Jacob was justice incarnate, a force that ensured cruelty could never go unpunished. Masters from nearby plantations began to take notice, though none dared intervene. Merchants and neighbors spoke of a 7-foot giant whose silence could unnerve even the most seasoned enforcer. Letters to the town sheriff described the land surrounding Black Hollow as strange. Animals avoiding certain paths, fences inexplicably broken, and shadows that seemed to move with intent. Jacob himself remained an enigma. He did not flaunt his strength or seek vengeance for its own sake. He continued his daily routines, tending fields, repairing structures, and watching over the workers, silent as ever. Yet the absence of the 9 overseers became a permanent mark on the plantation. Fear, restraint, and careful observation replaced cruelty, and the remaining men learned quickly that their survival depended entirely on reading Jacob's intent without words. By the end of the year, Black Hollow had transformed. It was no longer ruled by masters in the traditional sense. It was governed by the quiet, looming presence of the giant who demanded respect through mere existence. Stories of the 9 vanished. Men became legend, whispered across counties, their fates unspoken but understood. A testament to the inevitability of Jacob's silent authority. By the following spring, Black Hollow Plantation had taken on a new rhythm. The sun rose over cotton rows that gleamed white against dark soil. But even in the light, a sense of unease lingered. Jacob moved through the fields like a living shadow, his massive frame bending the morning mist around him. No one dared approach too closely, yet all could feel the weight of his gaze. Even the workers began to notice subtle changes in the land. Horses refused to cross certain paths, tools would shift inexplicably, and doors would open or close without cause. It was as though the earth itself acknowledged Jacob's presence, bending to his will silently, warning intruders, guiding them. Obedient. Masters from neighboring plantations were no longer confident in their authority. The tales of Black Hollow spread farther with each passing season. Merchants avoided the area at night. Traveling overseers carried warnings to their peers, telling stories of the silent giant who could appear where he pleased, and of the 9 men who had vanished in ways no one dared explain. Fear was palpable, tangible, and it followed them like a shadow. Jacob himself remained calm and deliberate, his massive hands repairing fences, loading wagons, or tending livestock. But when cruelty arose, it seemed to vanish instantly. A man might raise his voice or strike a worker, only to find his tools broken, his footing gone, or his path blocked by an invisible force. Jacob never spoke. He never rushed. Yet every overseer soon understood that the land itself had become a weapon in his hands. At night he would patrol silently. Lanterns swayed in the breeze, casting moving shadows across the barns, yet Jacob moved through them unlit, unbound by light or dark. Sometimes the workers reported glimpses of his outline, stretching across the fields, impossibly long, blending with the cypress and magnolia trees. Children trembled at the sight, and even adults felt a chill that had nothing to do with wind. The legend of the silent giant became inseparable from the plantation itself. It was whispered in the quarters that Jacob could vanish from sight, appearing only where justice was needed. Masters and overseers alike learned the same lesson. Cruelty would be answered, not by loud words or visible wrath, but by an inevitability that could not be reasoned with, bargained with, or escaped. Black Hollow's fields had become a theater of suspense, every shadow alive with possibility, every footstep weighted with fear. Jacob moved through it all as a living testament to power, silence, and the unyielding authority of a man whose presence alone could bend the world to his will. As the years passed, the presence of Jacob transformed Black Hollow into a place of quiet, relentless tension. The plantation no longer echoed with the cries of punishment or the crack of whips. Instead, a heavy silence hung over every field, barn, and quarters, a silence that spoke louder than any shout, a silence that reminded everyone of the giant who walked unseen among them. Jacob's routines became ritual. At sunrise, he would emerge from his cabin, stretching his vast frame before moving deliberately to the fields. He repaired fences, inspected crops, and tended livestock, yet there was a meticulousness to him that unsettled all who observed. The land seemed to respond to his presence, almost reverently. A fence would straighten, a gate would latch itself, animals would align without guidance. The silence was not empty, it was vigilant, alive. The workers, both free and enslaved, learned to move in harmony with this quiet authority. No one dared disrupt his rhythm, and when disputes arose, Jacob's gaze alone sufficed to restore order. Even the overseers, those who survived the vanishings of the 9 men, tread carefully. They spoke in whispers, their voices low, and avoided meeting his eyes for too long. It was a lesson learned at great cost. To cross Jacob was to court the unimaginable, whether human or supernatural. Travelers continued to tell stories, though few dared visit. The plantation's borders seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if the land itself reshaped paths to confuse intruders. Legends grew. Jacob could appear where he pleased, standing silently among shadows, observing, judging, and never wronged. It was said that those who attempted cruelty at Black Hollow would find their tools fail, their animals balk, and their courage evaporate. At night, the silence deepened. Lanterns swung in the windless air, casting long, flickering shadows. Trees whispered in a breeze no one felt. The workers spoke in hushed tones of the 7-foot giant moving through the fields like a specter, appearing to inspect the land or silently standing over a man who had misstepped, enforcing a justice no human could administer. Jacob never spoke of the past, of the 9 men, or of his own life before Black Hollow. His silence was total, impenetrable. And yet it communicated everything: authority, inevitability, and the unspoken truth that cruelty could not go unchecked. Over time, Black Hollow ceased to be remembered as a plantation of masters and laborers. It became a legend, a tale of a silent force that redefined power. Jacob's shadow lingered in every corner, his footsteps never fading entirely, leaving an enduring imprint on those who had survived, and on the stories that would never die. No one knew exactly when Jacob left Black Hollow. Some say he vanished. One night under a heavy fog, the plantation silent except for the whisper of wind through the cypress trees. Others claim he simply walked into the forest beyond the cotton fields, disappearing into the shadows as though the earth itself had swallowed him whole. Whatever the truth, his absence was felt immediately. A weight lifted, yet a tension remained, as though the land still remembered his presence. The workers noticed first. Fields no longer seemed to align themselves with meticulous precision. Animals grew restless. Tools required more care, and the air lost the thick, expectant quiet that had defined Jacob's dominion. Even the overseers who had survived trembled, realizing that the balance they had learned to fear and respect had shifted. Black Hollow was no longer governed by inevitability, but by uncertainty. Stories of his departure spread quickly. Some claimed he had gone to punish injustice elsewhere, a wandering force of retribution. Others whispered that he had returned to the shadowed forest from which he had once emerged, reclaiming the solitude that allowed him to exist unchallenged. Legends grew that, even in absence, Jacob's eyes could be felt watching, his silence echoing across the fields in the rustle of leaves or the creak of barnwood. Masters and travelers alike became obsessed with the tale. Black Hollow was now a haunted place in reputation, even without him present. Neighbors reported glimpses of a massive figure moving through the woods at dusk, though none could confirm it was Jacob. They swore the plantation carried his memory in its soil, its fences, even in the wind that swept across the cotton rows. The enslaved workers spoke of him in reverent tones. Jacob had been their protector, their silent enforcer, and now he had left them to navigate the world without his presence. Yet his lessons lingered. Cruelty had consequences, and justice, though silent and unseen, could arrive in ways unimaginable. Over time, Jacob became more myth than man. Travelers told tales of the 7-foot giant who enforced his own brand of order, shaping the land and lives around him. Black Hollow became a symbol, a story repeated in whispers and letters, a warning to all who sought to impose fear upon others. Even after his departure, his influence endured. The plantation's fields, though still worked, carried a memory of his dominion. And in the minds of those who had seen him, the giant remained present. A figure of silent authority, unstoppable, immortal in legend. Decades passed, yet the story of Jacob never left the Carolina hills. Travelers told it in hushed tones at taverns. Merchants warned their children of the 7-foot giant whose silence carried more weight than any whip or gun. Black Hollow Plantation, though abandoned in parts, became a place of whispered fear, a testament to a man whose presence had reshaped the world around him. Even those who had never seen him swore they felt his shadow lingering in the fields. On quiet mornings, the mist seemed to twist unnaturally over the cotton rows, as though moving with purpose. Doors would creak open on their own. Fences would fall mysteriously. The land itself seemed alive, recalling the giant who had walked it with such certainty and authority. Local historians and storytellers debated the truth of Jacob. Some claimed he was human, a man of extraordinary size and strength. Others believed he was something more, a spirit or manifestation of justice, sent to punish cruelty where law and morality failed. The 9 vanished overseers remained a mystery, a dark puzzle that no record could solve. Their absence, though unexplained, became central to the legend, proof that some forces required no witnesses. The plantation's workers and their descendants passed the story from one generation to the next. In the quarters, parents told their children, "Obey, respect, and act with justice, for the giant may yet return." The cautionary tale became a moral compass, a narrative that carried lessons far beyond the walls of Black Hollow. Merchants and travelers claimed that even centuries later, on foggy mornings or moonless nights, one could glimpse a massive shadow moving along the edge of the plantation, silent and deliberate. The wind seemed to carry whispers, soft and haunting, of a man who had never spoken more than necessary, but whose authority remained absolute. Jacob's silence became immortal. He was no longer merely a man, he was a symbol of strength, of inevitability, and of justice that required no words. Those who lived under his gaze remembered that cruelty could never go unchecked, that power wielded without conscience could provoke consequences beyond imagining. Black Hollow endured as a monument to this legend. Fields were tended, structures repaired, yet the presence of the silent giant was always felt. In every shadow, in every cautious footstep, in every pause before a harsh word or cruel strike, his influence persisted. And so the tale lives on. Travelers, descendants, and strangers alike pass it along, a story of awe and fear. The giant who walked silently, reshaping a plantation and the hearts of all who lived there. Jacob may have departed, but the legend he left behind, measured, silent, and unstoppable, never fades.